Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Allen, and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's virtual lecture. The American Revolution Institute promotes the knowledge and appreciation of the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, exhibitions, and other historical programs, advocating preservation, and providing resources to classrooms. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done this work from its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark finished in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson in Washington, D.C. Tonight's lecture, To Have the Bed Made, The Invisible Labor and Material Culture of Nursing in the Revolutionary War, features Meg Roberts from the University of Cambridge discussing the labor of caregivers, both military and domestic, during the Revolutionary War. Alongside the surgeons and physicians, the medical care of thousands of sick and wounded Continental soldiers relied upon the tireless work of Army nurses, camp followers, housewives, cooks, laundresses, and local families. In contrast to the voluminous records of soldiers and military leaders' wartime experiences, the contribution of women has often been summarized fleetingly with three verbs: washing, cooking, and nursing. The rich detail of this everyday and mundane labor, the changing of linens, the preparation and feeding of medicines, the sourcing of heat and water, the emptying of chamber pots, is not immediately apparent from written sources alone. However, by turning to Revolutionary era objects and material culture, we can begin to recover some of those invisible labor and reconstruct each element of nursing a sick or injured person in the Revolutionary War. Tonight's lecture accompanies our current exhibition, Saving Soldiers, Medical Practice in the Revolutionary War, and is made possible in part by a generous gift from the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati. Meg Roberts is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Cambridge. Her doctoral research examines the effect of health crises on care networks, care practices, and caregivers during the American Revolutionary War, and is informed by her academic and professional backgrounds in North American disability history and object-based museum research. She has been awarded several research fellowships, including the William H. Helfand Fellowship in American Medicine, Science, and Society at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the David Center for the American Revolution Fellowship at the American Philosophical Society, the Robert M. and Annetta J. Kofelt and Robert M. Kofelt Jr. Fellowship from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the AHRC International Placement Fellowship at the John W. Klug Center at the Library of Congress, and the AHRC International Placement Fellowship at the National Museum of American History, the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Now, before I turn things over to Meg, a few housekeeping items are in order. Following tonight's lecture, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions for Meg using the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen. And should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. Now, please join me all the way from the UK in welcoming all the way from the UK, Meg Roberts. Meg.
Hi, thanks, Andrew. Thank you so much, first of all, Andrew, and the American Revolution Institute at the Society of Cincinnati for having me. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, even though I'm on another continent. It's just such a joy to be able to write about and research these topics, and to have people want to listen. It's such an honor. So thank you very much. I will just share my screen, and assuming that's all good, I will get started. So this is To Have the Bed Made, Invisible Labor and the Material Culture of Nursing in the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War arrived on Abigail Hartman Rice's doorstep in January 1778. Originally from Germany, she and her husband Zachariah lived on their farm in Chester County, Pennsylvania, with at least 15 of their children. Abigail and Zachariah's lives were busy. Zachariah was a cartwright employed locally on various building projects and responsible for maintaining their 400 acres of farmland. Abigail was a housewife employed in the endless daily tasks involved in running a household and responsible for maintaining at least 15 children. About 9 miles away, the Continental Army had settled into their frosty winter encampment at Valley Forge, after months of exertion, malnourishment, and military defeat. Facing a growing epidemic of sick, starving, and frostbitten soldiers, on January 3rd, George Washington ordered the construction of the Army's first permanent military hospital at Yellow Springs, Chester County, just a mile down the road from the Rice family. We can assume that Abigail became familiar with the hospital very quickly, as Zachariah was employed to help build the 3-story structure. Once the patients moved in, according to one of her descendants, Abigail began making the journey more regularly, quote, carrying foods and delicacies to the sick and wounded soldiers. Supplies of food, medicine, firewood, soap, blankets, and other provisions were scarce, and the hospital overcrowded and diseases rampant. It's only from a descendant's application to the Sons of the American Revolution that we know that Abigail's visits to Yellow Springs evolved into the nursing role that she's remembered for. The current inscription on her gravestone, referring to her as a nurse in the American Revolution, is a replacement for the original marker, which apparently made no mention of her formal care work and emphasized her role as a mother of 21, 15 of whom were alive during the Revolutionary War. The only other thing that we know about Abigail's life is that she died from typhoid fever in 1789, contracted during her time at the hospital and causing health issues from which she never recovered. Yellow Springs was one of the better managed revolutionary hospitals, but typhus, typhoid fever, dysentery, and pneumonia still flourished in the unsanitary and cramped conditions. In recent years, Abigail Hartman Rice has been held up as the model female patriot, the Florence Nightingale of the Revolutionary War. Her death as a result of her caregiving is emphasized as a patriotic sacrifice, tragic, but typical of the selflessness of the ideal caregiver. This narrative is engrossing and allows us to highlight the contributions of ordinary women in the war. However, we don't actually know much about the labor that Abigail performed. For example, what were the foods and delicacies that she brought the soldiers? How did she care for them? What did it actually mean to be a nurse during the Revolutionary War? So when I'm talking to new people about my research and I tell them that it's about medical care in the Revolutionary War, they usually want to hear about the gruesome parts, as you can expect. They want painful details about surgeries and amputations so that they can cringe in horror at the appropriate moment. They enjoy having the opportunity to laugh about the mistaken medical knowledge of the 18th century. I do have a lot of fun describing how to use a leather amputation retractor or a lancet, and always have some stories up my sleeve about the feuds and gossip within the Continental Army's medical department. There was a lot, there was so much drama, they all hated each other. But my research actually barely touches on those juicier or more gruesome parts of medical care during the war. I look at the labor that follows the drama, which is almost by definition less exciting. I'm interested in the mundane, the washing and changing of linens and clothing, the preparation of medicines and food, the emptying of chamber pots and bedpans, the maintenance of warmth, comfort, and cleanliness, the bedside watch day and night, assessing changes in the patient's condition, and weighing up the available sources of medical knowledge. I define all of these actions as caregiving or care work, which extends beyond medical treatment alone and includes any labor involved in maintaining the immediate physical and emotional needs of the sick or injured. This definition of a caregiver overlaps substantially with some definitions of a nurse, but also with everyday domestic duties that were performed by most housewives, servants, enslaved women, and community healers of the 18th century. The Continental Army defined the responsibilities of official army nurses extremely narrowly, but relied on the informal care work of thousands of women and men to meet the needs of the sick and wounded. The labor involved in caregiving is not particularly dramatic or exciting, but it was performed every single day of the Revolutionary War by people who are mostly unnamed in the historical record. So just to give you a bit of an outline, I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction to the care arrangements in the war and sort of the medical department and hospitals, and then lead into why we don't know more about, we know so much about the organization of the department and not a lot about the actual medical labor that caregivers broadly defined, were doing. And then I'm going to go on to the main section of the talk, which is to suggest how we might use material culture objects to learn more about the actual details of the labour. So, as you know from the Society's wonderful exhibition, Saving Soldiers, the late 18th century was an era of epidemics, rudimentary sanitation, harsh climates, and a mixture of traditional, exploratory, and professionalizing medicine. The state of health of any individual was always precarious and fluctuating. Few could avoid being dependent on the care of another at some point in their lives. So it was a far cry from modern, or at least pre-COVID, perceptions of impairment and illness as exceptional or occasional. On top of this, the Revolutionary War was the most violent North America had seen since European colonization. Injury and disease killed tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides, and many thousands more were left with long-term impairments or illnesses. Private homes, public buildings, barns, huts, churches were all filled with the sick and wounded, both soldiers and civilians, all reliant on the care of others. So the war was what we would now describe as a health crisis. The Continental Army responded to this crisis with a combination of organized, authorized hospital employees and desperate reliance on any suitable care workers, such as camp followers or local people from the nearby towns. Imitating the organization of the British Army, the Continental Medical Department planned for each military hospital to be staffed by surgeons, surgeons' mates, storekeepers, apothecaries, orderlies, all of them male, and then nurses, a matron, and a male steward. On paper, nurses' duties were menial and centered around washing soldiers, cleaning wards, and emptying chamber pots. As you can see on the detail of this job description on the screen, from the Continental Congress, nurses were only supposed to administer medicine in the absence of male surgeons or surgeons' mates. George Washington particularly preferred the work that he considered unskilled to be performed by women, as he was keen that the men of the army be free for battle. When the paltry wages, poor conditions, and disregard of their work failed to keep enough nurses in the army, however, Washington tried to entice more women by asking Congress to raise nurses' pay. He despaired that, quote, "We are under the necessity of substituting in their place a number of men from the respective regiments, whose service by that means is entirely lost in the proper line of duty, and but little benefit rendered to the sick." Many soldiers hired local women to cook, sew, and wash their clothes for them rather than do it themselves, exposing local communities to unsanitary conditions and rampant camp diseases. Washington also ordered that soldiers' wives and other women following the army only receive rations if they prove themselves actually useful by nursing, cooking, washing clothes, and cleaning for the soldiers. Again, nursing defined as extremely menial labor, not involving any actual medical treatment. At the height of the revolutionary health crisis, however, these strictly delineated gendered roles and duties became more fluid. By January 1777, William Shippen and John Cochrane were recommending that hospitals hire nurses, men or women, to care for the overwhelming numbers of sick and wounded. The shortages of labor, supplies, and hospital space were so dire for the majority of the war that anyone able to contribute any kind of caregiving was put to work. It is highly implausible, therefore, that nurses stuck to their official duties and left all medical treatment to surgeons' mates in these conditions. A few specifically designated and sort of specific general hospitals were built, but most medical care took place in flying hospitals. These were basic huts or tents in camp, or requisitioned churches, halls, barns, and houses in nearby towns. This arrangement inevitably blurred the boundaries between the local community and the army community. Where the official hospital staff structure couldn't cope, local community care networks frequently sprang into action to care for the soldiers. Often they were housewives like Abigail Hartman Rice, who would leave their families at home while they worked at nearby temporary hospitals. There is also evidence of locals like Abigail Hartman Rice delivering food, blankets, and sometimes medical supplies to the hospitals as they would for members of their own communities. There are also numerous cases of families taking soldiers into their homes and caring for them there. When Lafayette was wounded in the Battle of Brandywine, he was taken to the Moravian village of Bethlehem and cared for by the young Liesl Beckel and her mother Barbara in their home. We can safely assume that Liesl already had a basic understanding of medical practice, simply because care work and healing was central to women's domestic labor in this period. Healing knowledge was shared across intricate networks of women across different generations and families. Young women would learn to treat illnesses and injuries by assisting their mothers as they cared for members of the community. And the Revolutionary War provided ample opportunity for this education. Mary Harris recollected frequently aiding her mother in dressing the wound of a family friend who was injured in a battle in 1776. When the same soldier returned home in the aftermath of the 1778 Florida campaign with a severe spell of sickness and an inflamed wound, the young Mary again served as his nurse, now graduated somewhat from her mother's supervision. So bearing in mind this wide diversity of care arrangements, it's clear that medical care for soldiers extended far beyond the army surgeons and the medical department. To get an accurate impression of the medical environment of the Revolutionary War, we have to think about both military and domestic medicine as integrated practices. Most published histories of medicine and health in the Revolutionary War have focused on the management of the medical department and the professional medical practice of male surgeons and physicians. Military leaders and soldiers' experience of the wartime health crisis have also been written about and analysed to a great extent. But in contrast, the experiences of female nurses and other caregivers tend to be summarised fleetingly with a cluster of vague verbs: washing, cooking, sewing, and nursing. These verbs obscure a vast amount of strenuous work, each encompassing numerous skilled tasks and often performed without respite. The rich detail of caregivers' everyday labour was crucial to the functioning of the Continental Army, and yet it's missing from our understanding of the Revolutionary War. So why is this? Why don't we know anything about caregiving labour, the sort of mundane part of caregiving labour, and where it overlaps with medical care? The easy answer is that we don't have a lot to work with. For one thing, care labour was so routine that it is very rarely mentioned in any written sources from the period. Even now, most people don't make a note every time they change their bed sheets or take some painkillers to a family member who has a headache. Why would you? Unless you're a historian and thinking about the future historical record, like I was during the COVID lockdowns, which is very overwhelming. Health is mentioned frequently in 18th century letters and diaries, as illness was so common in this period, but the many acts of mundane labour that surrounded every illness and treatment are very rarely remarked upon. This is unsurprising when we understand letter writing as a process of narrative building. Women's diaries at this time were written in the knowledge that they would likely be read aloud by close friends and family as part of a parlour social event. Men's diaries rarely mention caregiving, and when they do, they use those same verbs that historians now have been using: cooking, cleaning, washing, and nursing, and then they move on quickly. The main body of sources that historians have used to understand the American Revolution naturally tend towards the dramatic, written with political, personal, or military motives, or just to produce a compelling story. This, of course, provides valuable analysis of the most apparent events and perspectives surrounding the war, but it leaves crucial experiences and realities of thousands of American caregivers out of the revolutionary story. So I'll just give you a quick example from a well-known revolutionary event, which you'll be able to see on the screen. So most books and courses on the events building up to the war include the infamous tarring and feathering of customs official John Malcolm in 1774. After an altercation in an extremely tense and frosty Boston January, a crowd stripped Malcolm of his clothes, dislocating his arm, and daubed his skin with hot scalding tar and feathers. They paraded him around town long enough for the tar to freeze, and after 5 hours deposited him on his doorstep to be met by his wife and household. George Hughes' oft-cited account of the event describes in detail the frostbitten damage to Malcolm's body, including, quote, the separation and peeling off of some fragments of loose skin and flesh. Hughes then jumps forward in time, noting that Malcolm later took these fragments of flesh, very gross, back to England, preserved in a box as evidence of his trials to apply for a pension. But we can surmise that before he returned to England, Malcolm was in bed recovering for many weeks because the physical effects of his body, having his body beaten, whipped, burned, and broken for 5 hours, left him dependent on the care and labour of others. The political violence that he experienced had implications not just for Malcolm and the patriot mob and the course of the revolution, but also for the caregivers in his life, perhaps his wife, his children, or his servants. The account does not reflect on the painful, laborious aftermath of these injuries. The mundanity of recovery is not narratively significant. In one narrative jump, the weeks of people's daily labour, changing dressings, washing linens, preparing remedies, feeding, washing, and monitoring a bedridden man are omitted from our knowledge of this crucial revolutionary event. At the core of this issue is the textual silence of the people actually performing the majority of the care work. Caregiving could be done by anyone, but overwhelmingly it fell to housewives, children, domestic servants, and poor or enslaved women. All these groups have left little textual trace, especially in comparison to their male counterparts. The text sources that historians often use were usually written by people with both the time to write and, crucially, the status for their writing to be preserved. This eliminates the vast majority of domestic servants and poor or enslaved women and men, as well as most middling women. Even where literacy rates were high and where housewives, servants, and nurses may have had the time to pen their thoughts and activities each day, the survival of their experiences depends on a consistent assessment of its value, of their record's value for over 2 centuries. Most of the letters and diaries that we still have access to were written by elite, literate families whose descendants were in a position to keep and maintain their papers, or which were immediately deemed significant to the United States national history. For that reason, we have a great number of sources written by and about medical men involved in the revolution, as demonstrated by this exhibition. The medical print culture crossing the Atlantic from Britain and France to America was so thorough and popular among American physicians by the 1770s that we have a really good idea of the publications that were influencing medical practice during the war, which is obviously super useful. In addition, the process of organizing the Continental Army Hospital Department left an extensive paper trail, most of which has been preserved due to its clear relevance to the historic founding of the nation. Letters between George Washington and the various surgeons general and hospital directors give us some sense of the conditions in military hospitals and the supplies and equipment that were used or lacking. Reports and diaries from surgeons, soldiers, and local residents often detail the sufferings of the sick and wounded, as well as the location of different flying hospitals. Occasionally, they mention the presence of official nurses or surgeons' mates or local women attending the patients, but there is little to no detail about their work. Even in a domestic setting, where much of the war's nursing took place, male writers tend not to describe the labour of the women around them that were performing care work. I'll give you a few examples from my research. Retired Philadelphian apothecary Christopher Marshall was more thorough than most contemporary diarists in mentioning his wife's daily activities. So on the 15th of January, 1778, he noted that, quote, "My wife arose early in order to provide something for William Thorne, who was still very poorly." William Thorne was their neighbour, who they kept an eye on when he was frequently ill. This is a great start. If I'm honest, I'd prefer to know what the something was that Christopher's wife took. But if nothing else, I can use this as evidence that visitation was a key part of community care networks. However, Christopher immediately goes on to describe his care for his horse and cow in much more detail than he described his wife's care for William Thorne. He says, "I went, served a horse and cow with hay, then returned to the fire, set to reading and writing, and afterwards went serve the horse with chopped wheat and cut straw." Again, not a huge amount of information, but this time we do actually have some actual evidence about the materials and labor involved in caring for individual horses and cows in this period and region. In contrast, all that we know about the Marshals' care for their ambiguously sick neighbor is that it involved delivering something to his home, and we don't know a lot else. There are so many legitimate reasons for this omission. Maybe Christopher was too sleepy to notice what his wife left with in the morning. Why should he note down the exact details of her labor to help future historians understand the intricacies of nursing and illness 250 years ago? We can't really blame Christopher Marshall, especially as most male writers in this period include even less information than this about the women working around them. But the fact that the vast majority of our sources are from people who have little interest in recording details about caregiving does leave us with a glaring lack of knowledge about domestic and military nursing during the revolutionary period. As an addendum to this, it's obviously not just male writers who omit these details. Middle and upper class women, especially those with the time to write at length about their domestic lives, do not tend to include details of the mundane practical labor involved in caring for a household, especially when they have servants to do it. The Quaker diarist Elizabeth Drinker wrote extensively about every single stage of each illness and injury that she and her family suffered before, during, and after the war, but very rarely does she mention the laundry, the cooking, the warming of patients, emptying or cleaning that were inevitably necessitated by the household's afflictions. We know that the Drinker household had servants, but their labor is often rendered invisible by a grammatical quirk. Elizabeth will often write sentences like, "Molly rather better, she was taken up and had her bed made for the first time," or "'Tis a week this afternoon since my foot has touched the floor, unless by accident when getting off the bed on the chair to have the bed made." Unlike Elizabeth's foot, the passive voice carries a lot of weight here. We have no idea who is making the bed, or indeed how they are making the bed, how long it takes them, what kind of bedding they're using, and who is doing it. To Elizabeth, these are insignificant details, second to the fact of her own and Molly's suffering. But to the historian of women's work and to the bedmaker whose identity and daily labor has been made invisible to the historical record, the omission is conspicuous. So how do we learn more about the labor of those who have left little textual trace? I found that the experiences of caregivers are made more tangible by looking at the objects that they would have used. The process is very similar to that of any historical research, in other words, detective work. If we join together examples of ordinary material culture with the occasional scrap of written evidence from the vast paper trail left by medical men, soldiers, and elite women, it can be possible to piece together the activities that encompass wartime caregiving. Other than the sheer number of patients, the theory behind treating illness in a military setting differed very little from the domestic medical practices. Most women brought up in a household with other women had at least a foundational experience of medical care, as the labor, knowledge, and objects surrounding health and hygiene were traditionally considered part of their domestic responsibilities. Male physicians and apothecaries tended to be trained by apprenticeship, building their experience in small communities, so again, largely in a domestic setting. When we assume then that a large portion of wartime caregivers brought this domestic medical experience with them, we can learn a lot about military medicine by using written and material sources combined relating to domestic medical care. I've been experimenting with using the symptom of fever as an entry into exploring care work in the revolutionary period. Among the illnesses that fever could accompany were smallpox, dysentery, typhoid, typhus, and pneumonia, all of which flourished in army camps and other crowded environments. In a period before antiseptic, fever was also highly likely in the aftermath of surgery as the body attempted to fight bacteria. The labor required in caring for a feverish patient might therefore be a good gauge of a portion of the medical care taking place in war. So let's break it down into steps. Firstly, let's start with medicines and preparing medicines and the pestle and mortar, because there's a really gorgeous example in this exhibition. This one was used by William Chowning, a surgeon's mate in the Virginia State Navy, used for preparing medical remedies. A mortar is a sturdy bowl, and a pestle is a rounded stick for crushing things like spices, seeds, nuts, and herbs. They're instantly recognizable as they have been used since the Stone Age and are present in many of our kitchens today. People now tend to keep them for the occasional moment when a recipe will demand something like a crushed cardamom pod or ground cumin seeds. But in the colonial and revolutionary eras, they were an essential component of both kitchens and apothecaries, and would have been used to prepare remedies for most ailments. Lists of the equipment sought by hospitals during the wartime supply shortages reveal that apothecaries and surgeons were desperate for pestles and mortars. Dr. William Brown requested 24 for the medical department in February 1778, along with weights, scales, knives, spatulas, and pill tiles. Evidence for how this equipment was used can be found in published medical texts, but the women preparing and administering the remedies were often more likely to be using knowledge from oral traditions or their family recipe books. Passed down generations and added to and edited according to contemporary practice, family recipe books were functional heirlooms, which included a patchwork of tried and tested medicinal and culinary recipes. Recipe books are some of the best sources that we have to tracing the generational and collectively shared healing knowledge that women would have used as nurses in the war. Philadelphian Elizabeth Cultus's recipe book from around 1750 includes recipes to make a pigeon pie and to stew a rump of beef, but also to make a fine purge and to make an excellent vomit. We can be confident that she and her descendants would have used a pestle and mortar when preparing this recipe to induce vomiting, as the instructions begin: take a quarter of a pound of clear alum, beaten and sifted fine as flour. Beaten is one of the many words that indicate the use of a pestle and mortar. Other times recipes say ingredients will require pounding, or just specify which ingredients need to be made into a powder. The army apothecaries favoured earthen or copper vessels for boiling decoctions, but Cultus implies that any saucepan will do. In addition to powdering, housewives were well experienced in stilling or infusing medicines in water, wine, or beer, and often prepared them in advance before storing them in earthenware pots in the kitchen or pantry. After simmering, Cultus recommends taking the remedy every morning till your stomach is clear. This method does not sound particularly pleasant, but is consistent with the widespread medical practice in this period. The first step in trying to get rid of an illness, especially when fever was present, was through sweating, vomiting, and purging, so essentially flushing out the illness from your body. Mid-18th century understandings of illness in the body were still based predominantly on the Galenic notion of the four humours. So for centuries, practitioners of medical care had assumed that illness was the result of one's bodily humours, so blood, phlegm, black and yellow bile, becoming unbalanced, requiring the expulsion, letting, or purging of the dominant fluid to rebalance the body. A purge, used as both a noun and a verb, could refer either specifically to emptying the bowels, or more expansively to the expulsion of fluids via any method such as vomiting, sweating, bleeding, or blistering. Huge apologies, this is very gross, but it gives you some sense of the reality of the 18th century. Even as the field of medicine evolved and began to professionalize in Britain and America, humoral theory underpinned most traditional domestic and professional medical practice well into the 19th century, so all the way through the Revolution. The regularity of fever-based illness and the popularity of purging as a first response ensured that most family recipe books could be counted on for directions on purgatives, and any woman with domestic healing experience brought her knowledge of preparing laxatives, emetics, and diaphoretics to the military hospital with her, or to the soldier that she was caring for in her home. The majority of the medicines in the average Revolutionary War medical chest were purgatives of some kind, both botanical and chemical, most notably ipecac, jalap, tartar emetic, and purgative salts like Epsom and Glauber. Unfortunately, though, there weren't actually many medicines at all in the average wartime medical chest. You can see one of them on the screen here. These apothecary cabinets were fairly handily portable, but the medical department consistently struggled with drug supply throughout the war, so they often struggled to fill them. In the colonial period, early Americans had depended heavily on drugs shipped from Britain, and many of the drug merchants and apothecaries still in America were loyalists or tried to remain neutral. Privateers were able to redirect some medicines towards the army, but demand remained far higher than supply. James Thatcher, whose journal is part of this exhibition, famously wrote that the army was destitute of medicine and necessary stores for our sick soldiers. At the time, the most sought after medication for treating any type of fever was Peruvian or Jesuits bark. This very specific type of bark contains quinine, which is still used for treating malaria, and displayed clear benefits when powdered and given to a patient with specific types of fever. But the price more than quadrupled between June 1776 and September 1777, and the army could procure nowhere near enough to treat the number of fever patients that there were with all of these different illnesses from the camps. Most purgative medicines were also scarce, but desperate healers found some adequate alternatives in more accessible botanical ingredients. Rhubarb, for example, was a common household laxative. So you can see here the real blending of the kind of military hospital stores, which were not adequate, and then the kind of women healers bringing their personal expertise and intergenerational expertise to find alternatives to the scarcity of the sort of official professionalized medical remedies. As most of these remedies were delivered in the form of a liquid decoction or infusion, administering them to weak and mostly horizontal fever patients could be challenging. Luckily, the flourishing ceramics and metals trade of the mid-18th century gave a caregiver a number of options. Women who had brought up children might have access to a pat boat, which is just in the middle there. These had been used from the 17th century onwards to feed infants and sick people a bland mixture of bread or flour, softened with water or milk, and sometimes supplemented with medicine. Pat boats were shallow, oblong, handheld dishes with an extended spout or lip, and so were useful for gently tipping liquid or mushy food into the mouth of somebody without the capacity to feed themselves. Feeding cups or invalid feeders or sick pots, which are the two two objects on the either side of the pat boat. They were similar to pat boats, but more specifically designed for sick or elderly people who were being cared for in bed. As you can see on the left, the rim extended across the top of the cup about halfway so that a caregiver could pour a liquid remedy or drink into their horizontal patient's mouth without it spilling over them. Feeding cups were less ubiquitous than pat boats in the 18th century, but some of the more well-to-do local women caring for soldiers in the war may have had access to one. There are certainly a lot of examples that still exist in museums. Most of the time, though, nurses did not have the luxury of specifically designed medical ceramics. You may notice that some of the feeding cups have quite a familiar shape. One physician, South Carolinian Lionel Chalmers, actually recommended that caregivers feed liquid medicine to a bedridden patient with either a child's feeding boat or through the spout of a teapot. A teapot, of course, would have been a more pragmatic option for caregivers in both military and domestic settings. Drinking tea was such a crucial ritual in early American society that most households would have owned at least one teapot, with local patriot families able to donate their teapots to the war effort alongside their blankets and other supplies and their labor. The location of the handles on all of these options tended to give the caregiver much more control over the action than the patient. But in the absence of all other suitable receptacles, any available cup or tankard would do. In 1958, an excavation on the site of the General Hospital at Mount Independence revealed that some stoneware medicine cups were hiding beneath the foundation of the hospital, which were shallow enough to have been sipped at an angle. Which is clear evidence, material evidence that any kind of shallow sort of option for feeding patients was utilized just as shallow as possible so that it wouldn't sort of tip tip right over them. Medicine cups are much more shallow than the average sort of cup or tankard. So while the purgative worked its way through the feverish soldier's body, their caregiver moves straight on to the next task. According to William Buchan's popular medical manual, Domestic Medicine, the, quote, common practice in fevers was to load the patient with bedclothes to help induce a sweat. Buchan was wary of this method and instead advised that his readers achieve the heat necessary for sweating by bathing their feet in lukewarm water or drinking warm liquors instead. But despite his skepticism, it appears that most physicians and women healers did indeed favor the tried and tested method that I like to call a heat cocoon. This required any available sheets, blankets, quilts, or other warm materials to be piled on the patient. Their legs would ideally be raised, but in such a way that cold air could not reach their body through the gaps in the covers. A variety of objects were used to keep the patient warm in their heat cocoon. Some households had access to a warming pan, which, as you can see, had a hinged lid that could be opened and filled with hot coals from the fire before being run between the bed sheets. But where care took place at home, in the absence of more specialized tools, alternatives included hot flannels or heated stones, which were preheated before being transferred to the sickbed. One physician even advised that hot bricks should be laid at a convenient distance from the feet and legs, declaring that in cases of fever, they can, quote, scarcely be dispensed with. I actually went to talk to one of the brickmakers in the working brickyard at Colonial Williamsburg and to talk to him about this. And he told me that a brick can retain heat for up to an hour, and a hot brick wrapped in a damp cloth would feel a lot like a modern day hot water bottle, which I had no idea was the case. And I might actually use that now for heating myself up in the cold winter. But in the rudimentary flying hospitals, it was considered imperative that a feverish patient be kept warm, regardless of the method. The chills and shivering that are an almost universal symptom of fever would have persuaded carers to utilize all available sources of heat. Obviously, in a military hospital, even warmth could not be relied upon. All of the options for bed warming depended on the presence of fire, which in turn depended on access to wood. The excavated foundations of the General Hospital at Mount Independence revealed that the building was designed to hold several fireplaces spaced evenly along the length of the building, as you can see in this diagram here from the journal article that sort of revealed all of the archaeological findings. The Army recognized the importance of heat to patient recovery. Washington told one surgeon, "If you're obliged to make use of churches or houses that have no fireplaces, you should purchase stoves to make them warm and comfortable." Most Anglo-American households had open wood burning fireplaces, which did not provide radiant heat, but at least heated the area around the hearth. However, local suppliers quickly came to mistrust the Army's ability to pay for provisions, and supply relationships quickly broke down. The papers of the Quartermaster General, Nathaniel Greene, detail one dispute where Mr. Banker in Fishkill had failed to deliver firewood to a hospital. The hospital surgeon wrote that, quote, "The poor sick have suffered the most, being shamefully neglected in the articles of wood and straw. They would all have perished had not Colonel Hay come to his assistance." This is actually a very, very dramatic dispute, and there's a whole court martial, and it's really extremely dramatic and a really big deal because obviously access to firewood is a life or death issue when it comes to a military hospital. Straw clearly was also an issue. Hospital beds were meant to be simple wooden bunks with coarse linen bedding filled with straw, but many hospitals lacked even that. In the Fort George Hospital in 1776, quote, "The sick suffered much for want of good female nurses and comfortable bedding, many of those poor creatures being obliged to lie upon the bare boards." Blankets too were in short supply, making a heat cocoon impossible and making already sick soldiers vulnerable to further diseases. Colonel Anthony Wayne despaired of the Mount Independence Hospital, where there was no medicine or regimen on the ground suitable for the sick, no beds or straw to lay on, no covering to keep them warm, other than their own thin, wretched clothing. It quickly became apparent that soldiers cared for in domestic environments fared better than those in hospital. Caregivers were often monitoring fewer patients, and unless all of their blankets, bedding, and firewood had been requisitioned by the army, which did happen, they could contain enough heat to keep their patients safe. The next stage, I'm just going to give a little content warning. I am going to discuss bodily fluids. So if that is not something that you're comfortable with, just like turn the volume down for a couple of minutes. But obviously this was it was crucial to the purging process. If successful, purging caused the patient to empty their bowels or stomach, necessitating their caregiver to collect and dispose of their waste. This is one of the few tasks specified by the original job description of an army nurse that we saw at the beginning. They are to see that the closed stools or pots are emptied as soon as possible after they are used into a necessary house. A closed stool looked much like an ordinary chair, but there was a removable pot under the seat. Much like modern-day commodes, this was ergonomically suited to people who are unable to stand, travel far from their beds, or squat over a chamber pot. Chamber pots were extremely widely available. They are some of the most common ceramics from this period to pop up in archaeological excavations. Inventories and sale receipts are also extremely helpful for telling us about the toilet habits of households in different regions, and therefore different regions of theatres of the war. In Williamsburg, Virginia, Peyton Randolph had 11 chamber pots in his household, enough for each member of the family plus guests and enslaved people. His neighbor, John Prentice, owned a bedpan, which was shallow enough, you can see an example of a bedpan here, which was shallow enough to slip under the bedclothes, allowing the sick or elderly to relieve themselves without leaving the bed. Washington bought several chamber pots for his military household, but after retiring to Mount Vernon, he also kept a bedpan in Mount Vernon. In Philadelphia, by the second half of the 18th century, some well-to-do households had their own privy pit in the yard. Usually, this would minimize the labor required of the servants, but when anyone was ill or just didn't want to go outside at night, someone still needed to empty the chamber pot and the clothes stools. The nurse's job description doesn't really specify where the necessary house is that the pots should be emptied to in an army hospital. Most sites would have had access to a waste pit or a ravine or a designated spot for this purpose. In the excavation of Mount Independence, a small trash pit was found just outside the hospital building, which may have doubled as a temporary privy pit. However, doctors' growing fears about sanitation and hygiene during the war would suggest that waste might be deposited further away from the hospital to keep the patient safe. In both domestic and hospital environments, caregivers' regular trips to empty the clothes stool or chamber pot would have been followed by a thorough enough rinsing that it could be returned to the patient's bed or nearby. Evidently, each of these steps required considerable physical labor, in addition to the need to monitor the patient's condition throughout the peaks and troughs of their fever. The plateau of the patient's fever was a convenient opportunity for their caregiver to change and wash the bed linens on the sick bed. Laundry was an intensive and laborious process in the 18th century, even more so during times of sickness. Regular household laundry would have been undertaken by multiple female members of the household, domestic servants, or hired washerwomen. Black and mixed race women often worked as washerwomen, taking in laundry from households and nearby military camps, or serving as reinforcements when a household's washing load was higher than usual. Laundry involved several stages and methods varied. Boiling, soaping, and scrubbing seem to have been central to most methods and required access to a fire, a suitable volume of clean water, and a copper in which to heat the water, and also a large tub or other receptacle, soap, bleaching and starching ingredients, some kind of stick or brush for scrubbing, and perhaps a washboard. So a lot of different objects are involved in laundry. The presence or lack of sun was also a significant factor in determining the method, as the sun could be used as a bleaching agent, but then in the winter, indigo was a relatively accessible cash crop in the American colonies. Indigo or other bluing agent was combined with a form of starch like potatoes, rice, wheat, or alum before being rinsed and set out to dry. In the summer, linens were laid out or hung outside to bleach and dry in the sun for up to 2 days. Women washing for the army were paid poorly, but rates rose as army supply chains dwindled as they lost access to all of the different objects that are needed for laundry. By 1782, women could receive 2 shillings for a dozen for all articles which they wash, reckoning both large and small, provided they find their own soap. Contemporary opinions differed on how frequently to do laundry around a patient. S.A. Tissett's Medical Advice Manual, reprinted in Philadelphia in 1771, advised that a patient's bed should be made daily while he sits up, and the sheets of the bed, as well as the patient's linen, should be changed every 2 days if it can be done with safety. However, he also noticed a trend for a dangerous practice among the people about the patient who dread the very thought of his rising out of bed, leaving patients with the same linens throughout the dangerous stages of illness. In each decision to change the bed linens, caregivers had to balance both their assessment of their patient's condition and the various sources of advice and medical knowledge that they had access to. The excessive sweating produced by the diaphoretic during the early purgative treatment may have necessitated an earlier change of bed linens, but this could also be delayed until the climax of the fever had passed. As noted earlier, Elizabeth Drinker's approach seems to have been to time the changing of the sick bed linens with the convalescent movement of the patient, as she again noted that her daughter Sally was, quote, so much better this morning as to be taken up to have her bed made. Obviously, the identity of the bed maker remains unknown. Classic Elizabeth Drinker. So medical care during the Revolutionary War was at once an experience of crisis and mundanity. The care of thousands of sick and wounded Continental soldiers relied on the tireless work of army nurses, camp followers, local women, and families, but the details of this work have been considered too routine to record. It's only through digging a bit deeper and including domestic care in our assessments of revolutionary medicine that we can begin to understand the depth and extent of labor that caregivers performed. The care routines that played out in times of sickness were familiar, well-practiced, and drew upon extensive sources of knowledge and communities who stepped into their caregiving roles like well-oiled machines. The chaos and shortages of the war stretched these routines to their limits, and caregivers had to adapt. But through the sort of putting together all of these different sources, we can see sort of how the sort of mundane and the dramatic were merged together in to sort of create this sort of general experience of medical care in the revolution. The pandemic now is forcing us to reassess the workability of our own care arrangements in a crisis and grapple with our own notions of dependence and responsibility. Fundamentally, the idea driving this project is the quiet centrality of care work underlying stories of conflict and crisis, which I think is something we can all relate to in our own lives at the moment. I'm early stages, as you can see, of like putting together all of these different parts of the labor involved in medical care. But I hope that this has given a bit of a glimpse into just the sheer extent of really mundane, but also extremely stressful and dramatic labor that caregivers throughout the revolutionary period were performing without being sort of consistently named and recognized in the historical record. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Meg. That was fascinating. You've obviously done your homework when it comes to our exhibition. So you hit every nail on the head, I think. So fantastic. The questions are pouring in. So in order to give some time to catch up, let everybody get their questions in, I'm going to pose the first question here. So what enticed you to study this more in depth? What drew you to this?
So I think it was a sort of combination of a number of different factors. First of all, my background's in disability history and kind of looking at the accessibility of different types of work and the sort of growth of the idea of disability as factory labor became more prevalent. So, but I'm also really interested in the kind of objects surrounding objects from the 18th century. And these two things kind of merged when the pandemic hit at exactly the time I was starting my PhD. And I suddenly became very aware of the absolute mundanity of sort of day-to-day caregiving. I'm a caregiver myself for a member of my family, and the sort of emotional and physical labor involved is so varied and so extensive. And I could really sort of see that coming through in all these sources from the women whose like diaries we do have access to. It really kind of showed the depth of like their priority wasn't necessarily the sort of politics that was going on at the time. They weren't necessarily saying like giving their political opinions on how the revolution was being managed. What they cared about was what was right in front of them, whether their family or their neighbors or the soldiers that were in their town were being cared for, and their kind of health and the sort of success of their medical care. So it's sort of, it really, that kind of glimpse into people's priorities at a time when I think all of our priorities in the kind of beginning of COVID were kind of put into perspective, really kind of drew me back to the historical sources and found that there just wasn't like I wanted a lot more from the historical sources than they were giving me. So I kind of had to dig a bit deeper.
No, it's great. It's fascinating. Very little knowledge is out there about this. So you keep up the great work in that. So we had a few questions about the differences between British and American caregivers. Can you speak a little bit on that?
Yeah. So in Britain, the medical profession was a lot further on in terms of like there are a lot more medical schools in London and Edinburgh. There are a lot more trained physicians, and therefore the domestic labor was kind of progressing in a similar kind of way, but it had kind of merged with the professional medicine sort of a bit earlier than it did in the US. I think the really interesting thing about colonial America is that the revolution hits just at this crucial moment where they've only had a medical school for about, in Philadelphia, for I think be like 2 decades. It's all really early. All of the people that started the medical school, all of the physicians who started the medical school and are starting to professionalize the role of a doctor are the same people that are running the medical department in the Revolutionary Army, in the Continental Army. So you really see this kind of really raw kind of expression of or like experimentation with medical practices, because they're not quite at the point where it's so professionalized that they can have like a really smooth running sort of military hospital department, whereas the British they've been fighting wars with like a really efficient hospital department for decades. Like they're really kind of on it. And in fact, Benjamin Rush, one of the American physicians, is kind of snuck behind. He sort of goes to, I think, care for some American prisoners of war in the British military hospitals, and is really shocked at how well run their hospitals are compared to the American hospitals. And so there's quite a stark difference in terms of like how professionalized it was, which sort of the way that manifested is that it's absolute chaos in American hospitals, and but because they have this kind of backup of really well-established care communities in American towns and among like local populations, they did have that to fall back on. So it's kind of saved because there are so many people that just care for people all the time, whether it's a war or not.
Sure. No, I remember reading an account from Rush when he went to go to the hospital Brandywine, and he made note of that in the British doctors and how organized they were. So can definitely understand that. Now, going off of that, when obviously there was a state of desperation almost for caregivers when it came, especially to the American Army. Was there a certain recruiting process, or were they just picking up people all over the place? Was there a vetting process? Were people given certain tasks according to their level of knowledge?
Right, yeah. So it changes according to the time of the war and how desperate they are. So initially, the Continental Congress and Washington are really sort of picking and choosing, and they're really delineating different duties and like hiring people that they think are capable of sort of the different medical practices, or women that are sort of that they think will be obedient and like follow the orders of the matrons and the surgeons. But at the point that like Washington at one point is just absolutely despairing, because he's like, we just don't have any nurses or any female nurses. We're having to use male nurses, and we don't want to do that. So it does become just completely just like desperate. And you can see in all these letters between the surgeons general to kind of local communities. For example, the Moravian community that looked after Lafayette, they also looked after huge numbers of other soldiers after the Battle of Brandywine, which I'm sure you know. But they you can see in their kind of community minutes that the Surgeon General is saying, I'm so sorry, please can you care for these soldiers? Obviously this isn't ideal. We really wish that we didn't have to impose on your community like this. We know that you're only sort of 50 houses or something, but we absolutely need, like, war is just like, he's kind of just like, oh, you know what war's like, we're so sorry. Like so it does, you can just see the kind of picking and choosing turn into like absolutely just like anyone, that even people that don't want to care for soldiers, they're like, please will you care for these soldiers, because we have no other options. It's really kind of regionally dependent as well. It's just like whatever village is nearest, wherever they can get the soldiers to. And yeah, it's pretty it remains pretty desperate for the rest of the war. Yeah.
So this was a regional thing. So these caregivers weren't moving with the armies. It was basically, they're going here, they're staying there, and then when the army left, they wouldn't accompany the army.
So it really depended. So some of them were the wives of the soldiers and the families of the soldiers, and they would accompany them. But yeah, on the whole, I would say the majority of sort of hired nurses or volunteer nurses were from local communities, and were very much kind of sought after when the army were in a particular place. That's why the sort of flying hospital system worked so well, was they could just sort of pick up more people as they moved around.
Sure. Now, flipping the switch, I can understand that the British didn't have, wives and things like that for the regular soldiers or whatnot. Were caregivers pressed into service when it came to the British side, or?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't actually know. I know that they had there were wives that came along with the British Army.
Sure.
But I don't actually know if they were kind of enticed to care. I do know that when the British occupied different cities like Philadelphia, they took over a lot of the institutions. So like the Philadelphia Almshouse, really famously, is completely overtaken by the British hospital for wounded British soldiers. And the people running the almshouse are obviously like, what do we do with this? But they the British will kind of recruit local Philadelphians to work in the almshouse to care for the sick soldiers. Then their prisoners of war the British will try and get volunteers from the sort of loyalist and disaffected communities in Philadelphia to come and look after the American prisoners of war. So there's examples of Quaker women going to visit the prisoners of war in the State House who are wounded. So yeah, it does seem like, obviously, because as you say, the British can't bring a huge amount of people over with them, there is a lot more, they do find ways of using American labor, or the kind of caregivers that aren't entirely sympathetic to the revolutionary cause. I don't think there's many examples of them being like absolutely forced. Like it's sort of yeah, it's kind of, in other than obviously enslaved people, it's not that there isn't that kind of I don't think it's seen as something that's like an okay thing to do in wartime, to kind of impress on the local communities. But yeah.
Great. And you just spoke a little bit about prisoners of war. Going back to the American side, where was there a reluctancy for caregivers to care for British or Hessian POWs? Was that along the same lines? You know, because you obviously don't put a loyalist inside of a POW
Right.
hospital. Was there a vetting process for that, or did they just?
There wasn't really a conscious vetting process, I would say, like the whole thing, or not that's recorded. I think that's the issue with all of those things, is that it does seem like it comes across as extremely chaotic, the recruitment process, because they are desperate, but also because those records don't still exist, or aren't sort of in the detail, in that kind of detail. But I think there are some examples of kind of people, especially Quakers, that were trying to stay neutral, caring for prisoners of war, because it was a way of kind of showing that you weren't you weren't sort of picking a side, but you were doing some humanitarian work because you didn't want people to be suffering. So Margaret Hill Morris is a really good example in where does she live? In New Jersey, Burlington, New Jersey, who cared for both sides, because she was a Quaker, and politically she was meant to be neutral, but she was also quite a skilled medical entrepreneur, and knew how to like when people needed, she had a reputation for being a really talented caregiver, and she didn't really she wasn't particularly discerning in like which side she cared for. So it's kind of, yeah, there were definitely people that they could get to care for prisoners of war.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, fast forwarding a little bit to post-war years, were any of these caregivers compensated either monetarily or in material goods for their services?
Yes. So yeah, really interestingly, there are quite a lot of pension applications that do mention nursing, and but usually they are tied to a male soldier. So a wife will be applying for a pension in sort of the 20s, 30s, and she'll say, my husband was wounded in the Revolutionary War. I cared for him and other soldiers, therefore I'm entitled. Because you sort of had to fight for a pension and sort of prove that you were you were so entitled to it, because the criteria was so arbitrary of like who was able to collect pension, because they just didn't have the money for it to like give everyone a pension, basically. So you do see women sort of whose husbands often have since died saying, I'm entitled to this pension because he was my husband and fought in the war, but also because I contributed to the war in this way. There's also examples of men who are applying for pensions as soldiers, but also say, while I was a soldier, I cared for other soldiers. And like, it's a really, like often when they were doing smallpox inoculations, it would be other soldiers would care for, because they were quarantining, other soldiers would care for each other. And quite often that's included in pension applications. So it is, you can see there is some kind of material sort of compensation, but it's very rarely for like just nursing labor, unless it's a kind of like you were hired to do this laundry and you did that laundry. It's sort of like a sort of general voluntary nursing role isn't usually retrospectively reimbursed. It's sort of more like if you're employed at the time.
Sure.
Especially in the context of like they don't like after the war they don't have any money, the government doesn't have any money, so they're just trying not to give people anything that they don't need to.
Understood. Absolutely. Now, following the war, did any of the experiences of the caregivers motivate them to say go on to get into the medical world even further after the war?
Yes, actually, which I find really interesting. So one of the nurses that I mentioned, actually, I'm trying to remember which one she was. One of the ones who was a teenager when I think it was the one that Liesel, who cared for Lafayette, according to kind of like local Moravian almost like folklore, she went on to be a nurse for the rest of her life, and sort of inspired by her early experiences caring for Lafayette, she then continues to care for sick and injured people after the war is finished. The other example of the teenage girl who is caring for a neighbor with her mother, she also continues to care for people. So you can really see this kind of formative experience, which makes sense when you think about women's education at the time was very experience-based and would be extremely, it would be completely centered around like, you know, how to deliver a baby if you've been in a like in a room with other women who are helping to deliver a baby, or you know how to I don't know, dress a wound if you've been with your mother or other female relative or friend to learn how to dress a wound. Like these very formative experiences are really defining for a lot of these, like especially younger nurses.
Fascinating. Now, the $1 million question, and I think we'll end on this here. You mentioned recipe books and people doing them from home. In your research, did you come across any wildly obscure, absurd remedies, or and if so, what was the wild? Knowing our background in medicine, our knowledge today.
Oh man. Okay, I think I think the one that struck me as the most dramatic, I guess, was like it was in the Buchan domestic medicine, like the sort of really foundational popular medicine sort of advice book, where I think it's for a headache. I think when it's like, if you have a sick headache or like general headache, there are a few options. Number one, take this like herbal remedy. Number two, be electrified. And it just like the stakes just go so skyrocketing. Like,
no in between.
yeah, because it's like they just discovered like how to use electricity, or like the sort of not actual electricity, but like the sort of the principles of just kind of using any kind of like scientific, I don't know, it screams kind of new technology that people haven't worked out how to use
right
yet.
Yeah, clearly.
Wow,
fascinating. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Meg, I want to thank you so much. That was fascinating. As I mentioned, you did your homework, obviously, and you covered all angles of the exhibition, and I greatly appreciate you taking the time and for staying up late to speak with us tonight.
Of course.
Greatly appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Our pleasure, for sure. But now, before we officially conclude tonight's program, I'd like to point out that as you all leave tonight, a Google form survey will appear on your screen. We kindly ask that you share your thoughts and how we can make any improvements or any suggestions for any future topics for our programming calendar. Your feedback is always appreciated and is always most helpful when we go to develop that calendar. I would also, as always, like to invite you to visit our events page on our website, www.americanrevolutioninstitute.org, where you can learn more about our upcoming historical programs. Our next historical program is a lunch bite presentation on Friday, September 9th at 12:30 p.m. in the Research Library at Anderson House, discussing two maps produced by William Fadden in 1778 and 1784, depicting the Battle of Brandywine. So registration is currently open for that program, along with all of our other historical programs. So with that, on behalf of the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, I'd like to thank you all again for joining us. Meg, thank you for that fantastic presentation, and everybody for your continued support of our mission. So I wish you all a great evening, and until next time, good night.
Good night.